After weeks of ferocious debate and political theater in Washington, D.C., on Sunday, July 31st, 2011, the Congress of the United States and President Obama have struck a deal to extend America's debt ceiling and to begin reducing the country's spending. The Senate and the House still have to formally pass the agreement, but there seems little doubt that this will take place in time to avoid the financial Armageddon that is promised if America defaults on its debt. But is Armageddon really likely? What might a downgrade of America's credit rating really mean? The message that America has just finished sending to the world. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, and joining me today from London is George Magnus, Senior Economic Advisor to UBS Investment Bank, and from his offices on Wall Street in New York, Marc Chandler, Chief Currency Strategist for Brothers Harriman. A transatlantic view of what the impact of the budget agreement will be on America, the world, and investors. Here's our discussion, and my apologies for the sometimes noisy telephone lines. Mr. Magnus, what do you think about the deal that's been reached yesterday here in the U.S. on the budget?
I don't think there's any question, Sarwar, that it was more important to have a deal than no deal, because obviously if financial markets had kind of woken up, so to speak, to complete intransigence on both sides,
right,
I think the repercussions would have been very serious, clearly for equity markets and possibly for the dollar and other markets as well. And I think clearly at a time when the U.S. economy is struggling, that wouldn't be good news.
Yes.
Having said that, I do find that the terms of the deal actually rather troubling, and I think they speak to the capitulation of political leaders on both sides, to be honest, to the politics of extortion, which have been propagated by the more extreme members of the Congress. And I think this is very unhealthy for the United States alone and for the United States in the world economy.
Marc Chandler in New York, what do you think? People seem to be saying it's the best that could be done. What is your opinion?
Well, I think that in many ways the best that can be done really implies a really dysfunctional political apparatus right now. I think that that an agreement is better than no agreement for sure. I think that the long-term, putting the U.S. on a long-term fiscal sustainable footing is still lacking from this package. And it's going to come back and haunt us, even if we've depoliticized it by kicking the can past the 2012 election. So I'm concerned about that this is a Band-Aid on it. I mean, they reached, through the game of brinkmanship, they reached the brink. I think that George is right. They both capitulated, and but only for the minimum amount necessary to ease the immediate concern in the market.
One of the big highlights, everyone says, is that this is going to result, if it finally is passed, in the lowest expenditure, domestic spending, since Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s. Do you think this is something that the rest of the world is going to be highly impressed about?
I don't think the rest of the world will be particularly impressed, to be honest. And debate has become lost in all kind of ideological nightmare, really. So the tax revenue share of national income in the United States is now back to where it was in 1950, which is about 15%, when the budget deficit was about 1% of GDP. So if we want to have a 1950 style of economy, then, spending will have to be cut in a very kind of draconian way. I mean, so obviously in 1950, healthcare, social security, defense the agendas were very different.
Right.
But roughly speaking, those three sectors would have to be cut by around 7 or 8% of GDP, which is over $1 trillion, not over 10 or 15 years, but straight away. So that's clearly an economy that's out of balance. And I think the refusal to countenance the idea that tax revenues can play, and tax reform can play some part in making America whole again, I think is completely misguided. So yes, some taxes may have to go up, but other taxes could be cut. For example, payroll taxes, taxes that spur investment spending. Anything that creates jobs is good, from the point of view of economic and fiscal stimulus. So there has to be a much, much larger debate than just thinking about this in terms of expenditure, because America could cut its way back to a 1937 moment which obviously is the point where the bounce out of the Great Depression ended, and the United States was almost actually on the verge of slipping back into another Great Depression before obviously military spending came to its rescue.
And Mark, what do you think? Is this something that you think is a great achievement, that we'll go back to the 50s expenditures?
Well, I think that when we look back at this period, this is a period of a great embarrassment for the United States.
Wow.
I think that what's happening is because of the crisis and because of demographics, we're redefining the role of the government to the citizens. And I think that the U.S. is maybe taking the lead on that, and we're seeing a dramatic, basically, in some ways, it's a anti-Keynesian, it's like a rear guard action against the increase in the benefit that citizens receive from the government. And we're not going to see this, I think, not just in the United States. I'm not sure if we're going to have to go back to the 1950s, but it seems to me the political flavor, the political current, not just in the United States, but Western Europe as well, is rethinking those basket of goods that citizens get from their government and how much they're willing to pay for them. And so I think that this is a big assault on the kind of rights that we fought for, that our parents fought for, our grandparents fought for, things that were radical ideas at the time, like unemployment compensation, social security, the health care. Basic things that we now call entitlements are really the right of citizenship, and those are under attack. That's what strikes me about this crisis. Is in the past, various crises led to an enlargement of the role of the citizen and the state, a role of basket of goods that citizens get. And I think even as recently as 2000 and the early 2000s, when President Bush at the time gave in the United States the drug benefits, it was one of the biggest increases in the social safety net and the right to citizenship. And now the political flavor is to backtrack on a lot of that, really gut it. And I'm afraid that this is going to lead to a political backlash. Might not be right away, but people, after you give something to people, it's much harder to take it away from them.
Much is heard that if there was a default, there would be hell to pay around the world. So there's a default. Well, what does the world do with their money? I mean, there isn't any other real option excepting the dollar today. Is all of this really a media-made Armageddon scenario? Let me start with George in London.
I think it would have made a big difference if the United States had defaulted on interest payments on maturing debt.
Right.
I don't think it would have made a huge difference if, obviously, citizens had been defaulted upon because checks weren't sent out for Social Security or military wages or whatever.
Right.
I mean, very embarrassing, but it probably wouldn't have brought the world to a halt. But it's deeply embarrassing that, as Mark indicated earlier, about the functional nature of politics in the U.S. at this point. The wider issue, I think, is really whether, as I'm sure that a lot of people have been watching what credit rating agencies have been saying, notwithstanding their reputation anyway, but the likelihood is, in my view, even with the passage of this debt ceiling going through, assuming it does, that this AAA sovereign rating of the United States actually will be lost. So a lot of people care about that, and President Obama, obviously, and other politicians made an issue about the AAA nature of the sovereign rating and the AAA nature of American politics. It wouldn't make that much difference. I mean, people still demand to own dollars. It is still the reserve currency. People still need access to the liquidity of the United States bond market in its entirety. And so I don't think it really, it would have been a shock, and markets may have wobbled temporarily, the dollar may have dropped, but to be honest, the euro and the dollar in this so-called race to the bottom anyway, so in the short term, I don't think it really would have had a huge impact. However, the loss of prestige and the damage it does to America's ability to play global leader in a fractious world, I think would have been compromised further by, or will be, by the loss of the sovereign rating, or by the inability to basically manage the fiscal debate in a kind of an orderly and proper fashion. So I think this is an incredibly important moment. I don't mean today or tomorrow, but this period I think is a very, very important moment for the credibility of the United States act in the world.
Mark, do you disagree with that? And if you don't mind, extend your answer to also include what this does to Mr. Obama's leadership.
I think George has the right tenor here. My sense is that this would not be the first time that the U.S. missed a coupon payment. I think that you can find that the U.S. missed a coupon payment before, and under similar circumstances, it wasn't a big deal. It was a bit of a wobble, but it wasn't a big deal. Though some economists say that the risk premium for the U.S. has never gone back to where it was in the late 70s when we missed that coupon payment. As far as so I think that avoiding a technical default is important for the stability of the international financial system as a whole. As far as the rating agencies situation, I'm getting conflicting signals from comments from S&P, which had mentioned about a $4 trillion savings plan needed. Apparently, the head of the S&P has seen to soften that up a bit. I'm not so concerned about the debt rating of the U.S. per se. I suspect that if the U.S. were to get cut to, say, AA+ or something like that, that it really require a reweighting of everybody. That is, that the U.S. would still be the key benchmark because of the liquidity and transparency of the Treasury market.
Right.
But I am concerned along the similar lines as George painted for us, that the long-term status, prestige, and ability of the U.S. to exert global leadership, especially at this very key moment in time. It's not just the U.S. that has problems politically. Think about just what Western Europe looks like. Weak governments throughout, weak political centers throughout, and including, I'd say, in Japan, put that into the mix as well. And it does concern me that the political vacuum means that bold leadership at the time that we really need it is not going to be there. And I worry about the long-term viability of this in the sense that a lot of people talk about it, Bretton Woods 2. And what I think a lot of people miss is that Bretton Woods 1 required an incredible amount of power to be vested in one entity, that's the United States. I'd say that the U.S. right now is probably too weak to impose a new financial Bretton Woods, but it is too strong to allow other countries to dictate it. And so I'm afraid in this vacuum, it means a couple of things. I think you're right, Sarwar, that what's going to be the role of the dollar? Will that really change? And I think probably not in the short run, but it probably leads to a greater emphasis on the petrodollar recycling, on the Asians diversifying away from the dollar. So we're not really seeing it much in reserve data per se yet, but I think that's something that's going to be out there still, looking for alternatives. And if that might mean greater instability in the financial market, that people move to take a little bit of money. Remember the foreign exchange market, $4 trillion a day turnover. You take a little bit of that and you move into the gold market, and you have gold now at $1,600 plus an ounce. And I think that movement from foreign exchange into assets that hurt when you drop on your feet could be another sign of that looking for an alternative for the U.S. dollar.
George, if there is something that you want to ask Marc.
Yes, Marc. I mean, I really liked your the last answer to the question. But you know, my kind of principal question, I think, is if I ask you, obviously as a U.S. citizen and as somebody who's born and works in the United States, I know this is a bit kind of speculative, but how do you see this kind of working out? Do you think that this is the kind of that the United States is somehow inching towards some kind of financial crisis again, in which maybe some of the statements that politicians have made and the slogans that they've been kind of attached to over the last week, that they'll come to regret it, and that there will be an outbreak of sanity at some point?
An outbreak of sanity in the United States. I hope I live that long, George. I think that this is a partly, for me, it's not really and the same I'd say for Europe, it is not so much a financial crisis as it's ultimately a political crisis. It's a crisis of policymakers, a crisis of the elite. And so what concerns me, I guess, is that I don't see a resolution over the next 12 months. I don't think we really get anything until we get a clarification from the American citizens in the 2012 election. And so I think that we'll see what happens. Does the Tea Party take over the Republican Party, or does the Republican Party integrate and swallow the Tea Party? I think that the Democrats, it's sort of an embarrassment of riches on the Democrat side. They have the White House, they have the Senate, but they really still can't pass legislation of any merit, really, or without the Republican support. And it seems like the U.S., we not only have we really have three parties. We have a Democrats in Congress, and we have a Democrats in the White House, and the two of them aren't always on the same page. And this is why even at this late date, the new budget deal might not be able to be getting much of the Democrat support. And so I think that dysfunctional politics would need to be addressed, and that'll help avoid, or really tell us how, the financial problem can be addressed.
You've been listening to a conversation with George Magnus of UBS Investment Bank, London, and Marc Chandler, Brothers Harriman, New York. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, this is Sarwar Kashmeri. Thank you for listening.